Well, hello and welcome to another Experiential Coach Development Programme webinar. This is third in the orientation series, and it's all about developing a coaching mindset. You're hearing from me, Michelle Lucas, your course director. So what were we going to cover in this particular webinar? I thought we'd start with having some context and thinking through how coaching differs from other helping conversations. Then we'll dip into the meat of the subject. I'd like to share with you 7 coaching principles that have been developed by Peter Blackett. I think they can really help guide the conversation to make sure it is coaching and not something else. As you can see from this slide, there are 7 principles, and it's going to take a while to get through them all. So this particular webinar is divided into 2 parts. We'll cover off 3 principles in part 1 and the remaining 4 in part 2. As with all our webinars, there is an assessment activity at the end and a reminder of who to go to should you have any questions. Let's start with part 1. So consider for a moment the different kinds of helping relationships that exist. In my experience, there can be a real muddling between coaching, mentoring, and counselling. So I thought we'd start off with some very simple definitions. These are simply my starter for 10. In a moment, I'll invite you to do a bit more research on the web, perhaps, to see what other authors say. But to get you started, here's my sense of the differences. And as we work through, you'll notice some of the words are in green, and for me, these are the things that differentiate one from the other. For me, coaching is a purposeful conversation that's part of a goal-oriented relationship with an objective facilitator, and where the client drives the agenda. That differs from mentoring, which is also a supportive and purposeful conversation, but the difference is that it's part of an ongoing relationship. And importantly, there's a specific role for the mentor in terms of leveraging their expertise in order to benefit the mentee's future. That for me is a key difference, because in coaching, your own expertise has little place, whereas in mentoring, it's quite specific that we're probably working with somebody because of our expertise, and that's seen as useful. When we look to counselling, that has a more supportive and sympathetic tone. It also tends to be a series of discussions, often on a weekly basis. That's another distinction, because coaching tends to be on a monthly basis, whereas mentoring may well be monthly, but actually it's very often a kind of ad hoc and informal relationship, especially if the mentor and the mentee are in the same organisation. But back to counselling for a moment. Another difference is that whereas coaching and mentoring look forward, counselling typically is where the client will review their past experience and unfinished business. And it's the role of the counsellor to offer specific expertise in order to aid the client's understanding. So I hope you can begin to see a few of the distinctions. But of course there are many similarities, and that's why it's so confusing. Very often it's very similar skills, it's just that the purpose is different. As the saying goes, context really is king, and that is particularly true for coaching, mentoring, counselling, because there's a different emphasis with each. So as I mentioned a moment ago, it might be helpful for you to do some desk research, surf the web, see what else is written about these 3 helping relationships that might help you differentiate between them all. When you've done some research, have a think about what seems similar and what seems different. You may well have in your own mind a sense of what you're expecting to be the most directive, or perhaps the most challenging. That isn't always the case though. Different authors will see it differently. When you've done your background research, step back for a moment and think about the client's perspective. What is it that you think the clients are looking for when they choose one or other of these helping relationships? Let's move to some of the underpinning principles that I hope will guide you and make sure that the work that you do is firmly placed in the coaching space rather than anything else. If you'd like to know more about what follows, then Peter Blackett has written a book called Psychological Dimensions to Executive Coaching. You may well want to have a look at the book yourself, but if not, there's an excerpt of the key sections already on BoxNet for you. So let's have a look at the first principle, which is from tell to ask. I think that's particularly important given that many of us will be moving from expert roles as we begin to work as a coach. As an expert, we're actually paid to have an opinion, and it's a well-trodden habit to tell people what we think, to have a view, and to express that. When we move into the coaching space, we have to button it. It's a habit we need to break, as the most important thing in coaching is to ask exploratory questions rather than to provide advice. When you read some of Blackett's work, you'll see that he phrases it as though coaching is an inside-out process, not an outside-in process. And by that, what he means is that we may well have many pearls of wisdom to share with our clients, but they're not a sponge to soak it all up. They're much more of the acorn that needs to grow into a sapling. And in that sense, all we can do is provide the right ingredients for them to grow themselves. But we are all human. And so when we're coaching, we often find that we are triggered to tell. Have a think about a recent coaching session you've been part of. Can you remember what it was that prompted you to move to tell mode? Perhaps it was a real desire to help, or perhaps it was a degree of confidence, a little bit of ego perhaps, where you're quite proud of what you know and keen to share it. And what about your client? What is it about them that draws you to tell? If you've got a client that's very quiet, very often, that will encourage us to share some information to see if it will prompt a conversation in them. Or perhaps they quite literally ask you to tell them what to do. When you think back over a number of sessions, do you notice any patterns? And look a bit more deeply. Is there anything about the content or the context that causes you to do more or less telling? Have a think for a moment and perhaps write some notes in your reflective journal. Let's move on to principle 2. This is all about unleashing potential. Most coaching these days is very much fixed in the high potential arena. It's about working with people that can go further. They seem to know that, but what they don't seem to know is just how quite to get there. That's where the role of the coach comes in, really understanding how they can apply themselves for the future. I thought it might be helpful to have a quick lesson from Carl Rogers. And if you've heard of him before, then you'll know he's connected with person-centered therapy. Now, while that might be from the counselling field, I thought it would be helpful just to understand it, as it equally applies in coaching. His core belief is that people are pre-programmed to be self-actualizing. And what he means by that is literally to develop and grow and move themselves forward. He proposes, therefore, that the counsellor's job is to provide the right conditions for that growth, and he identified 3 core things: unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruence. Let's have a little look at what he means by those 3 things. When it comes to unconditional positive regard, it's really about respecting diversity. When coaching, you may well meet people from all walks of life, and it's important to respect those differences. It doesn't really matter if you agree or disagree with their values and beliefs. What matters is that they feel respected and honoured. He also talks about empathy, and you've probably heard the phrase, walk a mile in another man's shoes. And this is all about really suspending your own perspective and taking a look at what it might be like for that person from their perspective. The intention is to really understand how things are for them. And in many ways, that's where good questions come from. The third thing is congruence, which is quite a specialist label, if you like. In simple terms, you've probably heard the phrase holding the mirror up, and that's about reflecting back what you experience of the person in a constructive way. What Carl Rogers would encourage us to do is to be transparent about how we experience the other person and to articulate that in a positive and constructive way so that the individual can see themselves more clearly as a result. So if we're thinking about the client's potential, you may need to be the client's biggest fan. Think about the clients that you work with. What is it that you notice that you do that shows that you believe in them? And do you do this even when they might not yet believe in themselves? How you do this is bound to vary from coach to coach, and therefore how you articulate this could be helpful to your coaching bio. It will give people a flavour of what you might be like to work with. Let's move on to the third principle, which is about awareness and responsibility. This is one of the core components of any coaching work, really putting the client in the driving seat to make the choices for themselves. This is how coaching works, in my opinion. We all know the phrase, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. No matter how well intentioned, it's not about what we might want for our clients, it's about what they want for themselves. So learning, I think, takes place in 4 stages. The first stage is about raising awareness. When we raise awareness, we give our clients more choice. When they have more choice, they may have the courage to start experimenting. And when they've experimented with a few things, they might be in a position to make a decision about what kind of behaviour change would suit them best. So that's why, in many ways, our primary job is raising awareness. If we can kickstart that, very often the rest kind of follows suit, all by its own energy. Of course, we live in an imperfect world, and timing, we find, is everything. When a client comes to coaching, they have to be ready and willing to change. And that sometimes can take time. The important thing is that when it's right for the client is exactly the right time. It's not the kind of thing that you can push or pull with. The client will have to decide when they're ready to make a shift for themselves. And this is a really good question. Whose responsibility is it to effect the change? It can be very tempting to move into an influencing role as a coach and to start pulling the strings to help the individual make a change. I think that's a real watch out. You could be becoming a puppeteer if you're not careful. Coaching is all about helping the individual make the changes themselves. Let's have a think about why that might be for a moment and just compare and contrast some of your own experience. Can you remember a time when perhaps you made a change because somebody else was advising you in that way? How might that compare with when you make a change that was something that you decided to do independently? If you can sum up those couple of examples, consider the differences. In particular, what were the differences with how you felt? How did your commitment differ? Your certainty that you were doing the right thing? Or anything else that occurred to you? Make some notes in your journal about these differences and think through how you might use that when you're working with your clients and perhaps tempted to step into a more guiding role than allowing the individual to take responsibility for themselves. Well, that's the end of part 1. Hopefully you've got a good idea of the first 3 principles, and you can digest that for a little while before we come back in part 2 to cover off the remaining 7.